Hi, Apes. This is the way I'm going to be delivering content to you. So, I'm going to be going over the material um, and assigned to you as a video or ed puzzle, along with some reading assignments. And I would expect you to watch them, take notes, and then you'll be. I'll do short quizzes periodically just to make sure you're keeping up with the material, and then there will be a unit test on the material as well. And it will save class times for going over questions and on activities and things like that. Okay. So a typical unit has several topics. And I usually like to make a slide show for each topic, which I will also upload on a Google Classroom so you have access to them. Some topics are short, so I might combine them. Um, and yeah, so that's how you'll be getting your information and your materials. Okay. Um, Remember, I mentioned all in the videos that you watched over the summer that I'm going to be following what's called the College Board CED, or Course and Exam Description, which is this big PDF document that you have access to on your Google Classroom. And this is what kind of outlines the entire course, what their expectations are, and what are the topics and the objectives and things like that. And I'm going to be following that pretty closely. And make also use of the AP Classroom. That's the kind of the web based assessment and resource that the College Board has put out. Um, so we'll be, in order to make maximize the use of that, that's why I'm following the CED. The problem with that is that our textbook doesn't quite follow it exactly. In fact, none of the AP Environmental Science textbook follow the CED. um, but you know I have this document here that basically outlines what the corresponding chapters are for each of the topics in the CED. So this is again on the same materials link in your Google Classroom. It's the CD textbook and module alignment, and these are the topics, and then these are the modules, which are there's like the sub chapters of in your textbook. Okay. Just kind of keep in mind that we're going to be skipping around quite a bit in the book, especially in the beginning, because there's this quite a bit, is chapter 4, chapter 3, um, chapter 1, within the first 2 units. It does tend to kind of fall into line a little bit more as we go um, later into the units. But just keep in mind that you're going to have to be aware of what the reading assignments are, because it's not just we're just not going down. We're not going to be going in order. Okay. So you can refer to this document, and also for every slideshow that I create for each unit, for each topic, I'll have a little thing over here that says read this chapter and read this section in your book, so that you know what to do. So unit one. So unit 1 and 2 is called Living World. Unit 1 is focusing on ecosystems. Unit 2 is focusing more on biodiversity. Um, in the first topic, although it says Introduction to Ecosystem, it's essentially community ecology that they're getting into. So that's what the first topic is about. I feel like it's kind of dumping you in the middle of things. It's not really, but anyway, whatever. Um, so let me just kind of really show you what that looks like in your textbook. So remember, your textbook is a ebook, right? And I guess nice thing about ebook is that um, you don't have to carry around a textbook, and also you can kind of skip around and find it, find things, go in the table of contents. And then I think this also gives you the ability to annotate and highlight and bookmark and things like that, which is kind of nice. All right, so module 20 is community ecology. So community ecology is about interaction between populations. So that's what we're going to be talking about here. So here are all the readings you got to do. Okay, so all right. Now, this I just screenshot from the CED for topic 1.1. So here's your enduring understanding, your learning objective, which is to look at how, um, you know, basically what influences species interactions and what some of these species interactions are. Okay, so that's what we're getting into. So you should kind of use this essential knowledge as almost kind of like a checklist of things that we covered. But it's, don't ever think that this is all the information you need for this topic, because you do need to be able to give some examples and understand your relationships and be able to describe and explain and things like that. Um, Now, the AP Environmental Science, and I would assume this is the case with all AP courses, they're really testing you on skills. That's kind of their goal here, and they're just using these topics as a means to um, test you on the skills. And these skills are things that I'm going to be putting up here, and there's a whole list of them. You can look on the CED. Oops, way to go. Um, of what these science skills are that they're testing you on. Oh, that's not working. Okay. Um, but hold on, let me find it first. All right, so these are called science practices. And there are how many? Seven science practices, and they kind of go in order of complexity. These are things like, explaining concepts, using visuals, using data, doing calculations, all that kind of thing, coming up with solutions. Um, and these are the things that they want you to be able to do, and these are the things they're going to be testing you on the AP exam, using the topics that we're going to be covering. So, what the CED does is they kind of introduce you to different skills very slowly. One topic at a time. So there's always what they suggest a skill for each topic, and I will also put that up because a lot of the questions that they're asking is kind of based on the skill that they want you to get for that, from that particular topic. Okay, so the first one we're doing is describe environmental concepts and processes. So there are some concepts and processes that we're going to be looking at about, different interactions, and you want to be able to describe them by the end of this topic. Okay. All right. So what are we getting into here? So when you took biology, you probably learned about this kind of organization of life or hierarchy of living things. Started out with molecules and cells and tissues and organs and organ systems and organisms, right? And that's kind of what you kind of did in biology. For this course, you're kind of taking from that organism and kind of moving beyond that. So here's the organism. Here's the individual organisms. When you have um, members of the same species interacting that shares a gene pool, right? Um, all the members of the same species in a particular place at a particular time. That's a population, right? Like I said, they have a capability to potentially interbreed, so they share a gene pool. And it's kind of unit of these, everything kind of beyond this point. So those are population. Remember, same species in a particular place at a particular time, right? Now you have members of these, different species interacting, and now you're talking about community ecology here. So you might have population of looks like moose here interacting with population of, I don't know what that is, some kind of cat, right? So there's a predator prey interaction here. You might have some competition happening. So this is what community ecologists studies, is interaction between species, and this is what topic 1.1 is kind of getting into. When you start including what the interactions and effects of the abiotic system, then now you're looking at things at an ecosystem level. All right, and this is kind of what we're going to get into, in the next topics. And then also within unit, we're going to be getting into biomes. Biomes are particular types of ecosystems. So, like deserts is a biome, like typical tropical rainforest is a type of biome. So, these are ecosystems that share certain characteristics. They're called biomes, right? And if you include all the ecosystem and all the biomes on Earth, then you have the entire biosphere. Biosphere is essentially the planet Earth, at least the living portion of planet Earth. Okay. And also, and when we talk about, well, later on, we talk about kind of global change and climate and things like that. We're talking at the biosphere level in this course. Okay, and that's as far as we get in this class. We don't move on, venture into outer space. Not in this class. Okay, so here are some words to basically explain what I just said. All right. Okay. Just kind of going back to, this is chapter 2 stuff that I went over in over the for your summer assignment. We were talking about systems, right? And you know, systems are kind of the interacting components that you're interested in looking at. So so within an ecosystem, you might be looking at a particular system, right? Maybe like, you're looking at a lake ecosystem, a system within a lake, the interaction between the nutrients and the water and the organisms in it, or something like that. um, and within a particular system, you could have multiple systems um, that you're looking at, or you're investigating. There might be some interactions between them, and things like that. So yeah, so just kind of think back to what we're talking about here. Right. So these are all systems as well. So the community is a system, if that's what you're looking at. But within this community, you might actually be looking at a particular system, maybe looking at how organisms are competing, and that will be a separate system within that as well. Okay. So, yeah, so ecosystem are a result of biotic and abiotic interactions. So this is kind of the big picture here. So we're going to be focusing on the biotic interactions today, right? So here are some of the biotic interactions, or species interactions, that you should be familiar with. So you got competition, right? Predation, mutualism, and commensalism. And I'm gonna be talking about each one of these separately. Um, this just explains um, what the interactions are in terms of benefits, and whether they're negatively effective or positively affected by each other's presence. So in a competition, you have two species. Remember, these are populations, though. You're not really talking about individual species, individuals competing, or individuals doing things. You're talking about it from kind of a population level. When you have two populations or two species competing, they're both negatively affected by each other's presence. So that means if you add one, the other one's going to be negatively affected. If you actually were to take one away, the other one's going to be the increase in number, or increase, um, because they're going to benefit from the removal of the other one. So that will be competition. And this is how they often find out what the interactions are between certain species, by doing like removal experiments, or addition experiments, and see what happens when you add um, some individuals to the system, or when you take away the population from the system, what happens. So predation will be plus minus interaction, where one is benefiting, and the one that's doing the eating is benefiting, and the one that's getting eaten is negatively affected. There's different types of predations I'm going to be talking about. Mutualism is a plus plus interaction, meaning that they're both benefiting from the interaction. So if you were to take one away, the other one's going to be negatively affected by the absence of the other. Okay. And commensalism is when you have plus zero interaction. So the other one is not really affected by, it doesn't really care if it's there or not. Their population is not affected by the presence of the other. But for the species one, the presence of the other species, the other population, definitely benefits them. Okay. Again, I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. Okay, so the first one I want to talk about here is predation. So these, remember I said there are different types of predation. So they're all plus minus interactions. And usually when you think of predators, you're thinking about the true predators or these hunters, right? So you have like a wolf that's eating the rabbit. That's a predator prey interaction. And that will be a type of predation. But you can also have like herbivory, which is, I guess, will be a type of predation. At least when you start when you're looking at it from the the interaction, right? One is benefiting, the other one is negative effects. So that's a type of predation. And then you have things like parasites and parasitoids, where you have a host organism which is negatively affected by the presence of the parasite, right? It might not kill it though. So a good parasite should never kill its host, or it should not kill its host, because then it won't have a host anymore if it kills it. Um, that's not the goal, right? Usually, many parasites might weaken the host, but usually doesn't kill it. Um, and the parasites are often much smaller than the thing that it's feeding on, which is different from usually predators. Usually, the one that's doing the eating is a lot bigger than the one that's eating. So those are parasites. And then you also have something called parasitoids, which are that's a type of, by the way, this is lay eggs inside. So here's a parasitoid wasp it lays eggs inside its host larvae, usually caterpillars, and the larvae hatches inside the host and just basically eats this poor caterpillar from inside out. Um, yeah, so those are parasitoids. Okay, so those examples of types of predations. Just to note, the predation is a pretty strong selective um, force in nature. So there are lots of adaptations that organisms have developed to avoid predation. Things like camouflage and defense, right? Producing toxins to avoid getting eaten. Usually, and oftentimes, organisms that produce toxins are very brightly colored to advertise the fact that they're very toxic. Um, and actually, all of these guys are toxic. So you got some frogs, toxic frogs. You got these newts that are very toxic. And you got these monarch butterflies and caterpillars that are toxic because it eats a plant that's um, that contains these toxins. Oftentimes these guys are these brightly colored, like I said, to advertise the fact that they're poisonous. This newt, the salamander, is actually brightly colored on the underside, so it might be pretty cryptic when it's when you find it in the forest floor, but when it feels threatened, it will actually flip over and show its really bright colored belly to warn the predators that, hey, you better not eat me, I'm pretty nasty. um, there are some specialized organisms that um, will feed on these very toxic um, prey. And I guess the advantage of that is because they pretty much have a monopoly on this food source, because nobody else would eat this guy. So they don't have to compete with anybody else to for that food source. Same thing with these monarchs. The milkweeds have very it's got the milky sap that most herbivores will avoid. But these guys have adapted to feed on that and in fact make use of that toxin, and therefore they pretty much have a monopoly on this food source, although there's a few other insects that will feed on milkweeds. Okay. Um, this is an example of what's called mimicry, where you have a very poisonous individual with warning coloration and a mimic, often completely unrelated species. Complete unrelated type of frog, but they look very similar because it's these guys actually don't produce the toxins. Producing toxins is a pretty expensive, like physiologically expensive process. Um, and whether it has to kind of obtain it from another source or producing its own. And these guys are cheaters, and they're not expending its energy in producing its own toxin, but just looks like they're toxic. So they're actually benefiting from the fact that these guys are very toxic, and predators have learned to avoid them. um, and when you have a situation where you have organisms that's very toxic, and some organisms that have learned to deal with the toxin and have specialized on that organism. You get into what's called an evolutionary arms race, where one is constantly trying to outdo the other, and it leads to a coevolution. Um, so you have this, toxic salamander, and you have this snake that can, that has adapted to tolerate that toxin. So the salamanders is evolving slowly to produce more and more toxic like nastier and nastier toxins in order to have a leg up and trying to not get eaten. But then you got this snake that's also trying to slowly adapt to this increasing level of toxicity in their food source. So that's called the evolutionary arms race, where one is kind of always constantly trying to adapt to each other, right? So um, that's what predation can lead to. Here is an example of mutualism. I think they're fascinating interactions. So the mutualism is a plus plus interaction where both members are benefiting, and there's some examples of really wonderful interactions. This is acacia plant, or acacia trees, maybe, that has these ants living inside them. And so the ants are making habitat inside these plants, and the plant provides them, the ants, with some nectar, so food sources for that the ants can use to feed their larvae. And in return, these ants will very aggressively defend this plant. So if any herbivore tries to eat this plant, they'll come out in swarms and will attack. If another plant is growing nearby and is shading out this acacia, they'll go and trim them down so that it doesn't create that shade. So they're both benefiting from each other's presence. This one over here is a goby and a shrimp, and they're roomies, they're roommates. And what the goby is doing is, the goby is the kind of the watchdog, and it's it has very good eyesight, and it's keeping an eye on any predators that might come and try to attack them, and will signal to the shrimp if there's a predator near, coming their way. And the shrimp is pretty much blind, and it's relying on the goby. It's got one of the antennas always resting on the goby. And to get a signal when it's time to duck into their hole. But it's the shrimp that makes these little holes. It keeps it clean and kind of make sure all the little gravels and things is out of there. And if you were to remove either one of them, they won't survive. If you remove the goby, the shrimp just gets gobbled up by predators. If you remove the shrimp, that the hole gets filled up, and the goby has nowhere to retreat to. So they're dependent on each other for their survival. Right. Here's a sea anemone and clownfish, right? Where sea anemone is getting a protection from no, the clownfish is getting protection from the sea anemone, and the sea anemone may be benefiting. Maybe the clownfish is cleaning it and keeping debris off and things like that. This is almost a commensalism. I've seen it both ways. I don't know how much. The clownfish definitely needs the sea anemone, but I don't know if the sea anemone necessarily needs a clownfish to be there. I think they can survive just fine without them, but they might actually be a little bit better off if they're there. Right. Um, this type of mutualism, where you have a cleaner organism and its host, is a relationship that evolved many, many times over and over among completely different groups of organisms. So it's a very common interaction. So these guys, these birds and these shrimps are they're cleaning, they're eating off little parasites, maybe ticks and little parasites on their gills, picking off some leftover food and things like that. Um, and so they're getting a little snack, right? And at the same time, these guys are getting a grooming service. So it's a benefit to them. And some of these organisms, they could easily chop down and eat these guys, but they have a mutual understanding that, when they open up and in this way, it's an invitation for them to come in and start feeding on them, and they don't chomp down on them. So um, that's a mutualistic interaction here. Um, Now, plants and pollinators, or plants and animals have developed this very special interaction that basically drove the whole evolution of flowering plants on land, right? This whole the reason this diversification, like flowering plants are the most dominant types of plant on land, and the reason for that are the relationship that they develop with animals, right? Before flowering plants evolved, it was all plants were pollinated just through wind, so these ferns and mosses and things like that, right? And plants could only evolve onto land and become these flowering plants um, after insects and other animals on land that would help them with the pollination. So they um, diversified adaptive radiation that happened um, as a result of this interaction, and they have evolved to encourage that interaction. And you see this amazing um, designs of flowers and organisms that really maximize their interaction. So here is a milkweed flower, right? That grows in these clusters because butterflies need a place to land, and they like to kind of forage around. If you ever watch a butterfly, they just kind of land and kind of start poking around, right? Here's a flower that's pollinated by hummingbirds because hummingbirds need to hover, and they can't have so these kind of hanging flowers, and also this color is something that hummingbirds like. These are pollinated by bees. The bees you see in UV, butterflies too. So to their world, from their perspective, the flowers look very, very different. So we might see just a plain yellow flower, but to a bee, that's a bullseye, and just knows exactly where to go in order to get to that reward that they're looking for. Same thing with here; these lines are kind of basically directing them to go where they need to go. This petal right here on the bottom is actually sticks out so that the bee has a place to land, and it needs to kind of squeeze its way into the flower in order to get to the nectar. And in the process, it gets covered by pollen. So these flowers are designed specifically with bees in mind, so that they can maximize their ability to pollinate their kind. This is a pretty amazing interaction. There's an orchid, and this is the Darwin's hawk moth. So this was described by Charles Darwin, who actually never saw this moth. So this orchid so Darwin theorized, or hypothesized that this orchid must be pollinated by some kind of a nocturnal animal, because it's pretty drab looking orchid. It's not brightly colored and showy like some of the others that are pollinated by pollinators. And I think it had a strong scent or something like that, which makes it you know suggests that it's some kind of a nocturnal animal like bats and moths that would pollinate it. And then he saw that the nectar was at the end of this very long structure, and he predicted that something that has a very long proboscis is the one that's going to be able to access that nectar. So he suggested it's probably some kind of a moth that pollinates. And sure enough, they named this moth after Darwin. It's called Darwin's hawk moth. Nocturnal animal with a ridiculously long proboscis that are able to get to that nectar. Now, this is a very specific interaction, right? Because this flower can only be pollinated by that moth. Right? No other pollinator can do what that moth does. And the moth with this ridiculously long proboscis is only going to be able to get nectar from a flower that looks like that. So if anything were to happen to one or the other into the population, they're going to be affected by the if the other ones were to go extinct. So these are very specific. These are what's called specialist interactions, and this is a result of this coevolution, right, that happened um, to really maximize each other's to maximize the interaction between them. um, but as a result of that, they became very, very specialized. Okay, so a commensalism is when you have a plus, one member is benefiting, the other one is really not that affected by the other's presence. Although I don't think there's ever any completely neutral, you know, neutral relationship. So, for example, here's a mimic that I was telling you about, that you saw with the the frog, but you can also have it with monarchs. So monarchs are the poisonous ones. They actually retain a toxin from the milkweed that they feed on as caterpillars, and they makes them very unpalatable to birds that tries to eat them. And birds will very quickly learn that, like, yeah, don't eat those bright orange butterflies with little white spots, because the last time I ate that, I got very, very sick. So, this mimic is safe from getting eaten because of the monarch, the presence of the toxic monarch. Right. So these mimics is definitely benefiting from the presence of the monarchs, but the monarchs, really doesn't get anything from the mimics. Although, I guess you could argue that they might be negatively affected by their presence, because, you know, some birds might actually eat this and not get sick and say, hey, those orange butterflies were actually fine. And then they might end up eating them too. Right. So here's a another classic example of commensalism, where birds rely on trees to build their nests. So they're benefiting from the presence of trees. However, trees don't really get much from the birds being there, right? They don't. If the birds aren't there, the trees are fine. However, again, there might be some benefits to birds nesting in the trees. Maybe the birds will pick off some of the caterpillars, or the birds will might help disperse their seeds, and things like that. So, I don't think there's any the true, neutral um interaction here. Um, Barnacles and whales. Barnacles getting a free ride. Whales, don't really care that they're there. Same with the remoras and the sharks. These little fish are just riding in the wake of the shark, and just getting a free ride. Sharks really don't really care that they're there. These birds are following the cows, because the cows kind of stomp the ground, and kind of makes it easier for them to find food when the cows have stomped down the grass and things like that. This bird is following the trail of ants, because as the ants are making their way, the insects that are in their way just kind of get out of their way, because they don't want to get attacked by these ants. And these birds are just kind of sitting on the top of the tree, kind of watching, and just swooping down and catching these insects that are trying to get out of the way of the ants, but then the birds get them. So the ants don't care what the birds are doing, but the birds are definitely interested in what the ants are doing. Okay, so within these interactions, there are also something called symbiotic relationships. Now, symbiotic relationships are close and long-term interactions between these species. Um, and it could be, although most of them are mutualists, it's not necessarily limited to mutualism, as long as they're close and long-term interactions. So you can have commensalism, you can have parasitism, uh, that's symbiotic. So here, let me give you a couple examples here. um, s- Barnacles, that's a symbiotic relationship, right? Because it's a long term, it's a very close and long term interaction. This is not symbiosis, right? And this is not symbiosis either, because these birds are not living with the ants. They might relying on the ants, but they're not living with them. In the same way, most of pollination is not symbiosis, because they're not living with them, right? Um, and then like these guys are not either. But acacia definitely symbiosis, right? Living in close and long-term interaction with them. So what I want you to do here is I want you to tell me which of the interaction I talked about so far, or if you can come up with your own examples. So give me some examples symbiotic relationships. Okay. Um, Another special type of symbiosis is endosymbiose. It's endosymbionts. Okay, so endosymbionts is when organisms are living inside the other. Again, it could be mutualist or commensalist, or it could be parasitic. But if they're completely living inside, um, they're endosymbionts. So there are some endosymbionts in our bodies too, right? So see if you can give me some examples of them. There's the endosymbiosis hypothesis that you may have learned in biology, where the theory is that the the evolution of mitochondria and chloroplasts is a result of the engulfing of um, protists by other protists. So there was kind of ancestral eukaryotic cell engulfed um, some cells that but instead of digesting it, it kept it living inside their cells because um, it was able to convert, do some cellular respiration and provide energy, or was able to do photosynthesis and provide food. So it kept it inside, so it was living inside, and the that's how mitochondria and chloroplasts came about in this kind of ancestral eukaryotic cells. That's the endosymbiont hypothesis. Um, Proposed by Lynn Margulis. Um, it's the evolution of eukaryotic cells. So another, that's where that's what that word means. Okay. All right. So far we talked about competition, not getting into competition. Talked about mutualism and predation and commensalism. I want to talk about competition. Okay. So what happens when two species compete? What do you think is the outcome? Right. So here's negative interaction, right? So what happens? So just give me a quick, just like what happens when two species compete? Okay. So what happens when two species compete? Well, actually a few things could happen. One is called competitive exclusion. So here's what happens in competitive exclusion. This is how it was described. So this was described by a Gauss. Gauss is the name of the scientist, and it's called the competitive exclusion principle. So what he did was he had a jar of some nutrient, some nutrient in a jar, and he put a paramecium. Paramecium is a single-celled protist in it. And when you did that, the cells divided and it grew and it reached a certain point. He did the same thing with another species of paramecium, and something similar happened, right? So population increase and then kind of levels off. So this is them by themselves in these jars. Now, when he put them together, what happened was they increased initially, but one of them disappeared, right? Um, and that's competitive exclusion. So, and this is competition because they're both negatively affected by each other's presence, even Pyramis aurelia. So, look at what happened here. So, when it was by itself, it got to about 200 individuals per whatever, per milliliters or something, right? When it was in presence of Pyramis caudatum, it didn't get as high. So, they're definitely better off if they're by themselves. And the Paramecium caudatum definitely much better off without the Aurelia because they went extinct, right? And in this case, the comp no, so Paramecium aurelia competitively excluded Paramecium caudatum, right? Complete competitors cannot coexist. So when you have two competitors that are sharing the exact same resource, they can't coexist because one is always going to be slightly better than the other, right? I mean, if they're not the same species, there's something different about them, and whatever is different, it's going to make one of them slightly better at doing what it does, right? In this case, Paramecia aurelia, I think, was slightly bigger, and it outcompetes the Paramecia caudatum, right? Now, this was done in a jar, so there was only that habitat and there was only whatever food that was in there, and there was really no other way to make use of the environment except the way they were doing it, and in which case you get this type of exclusion. But if you look at around in the world, you see bunch of species coexisting, They might be competing, but not to a point where they're going to exclude each other, right? You won't have the diversity we have in this world if this was what was always going to happen. So instead, what happens? Something called resource partitioning. So this is what populations do in presence of um, other populations that they're competing with. Okay, so here's an example here. Here are some barnacles that's growing in an intertidal zone. Now, if they're by themselves, they'll take up the whole area. So A by itself, the Cathalamus by itself, if it was living here, it would just probably take up the entire intertidal zone. Maybe even prefer to be slightly more wet because that's where the food is. Balanus by itself probably dominate the whole thing. But when they're both together, what happens is the one that's slightly better competitor is going to end up taking the more favorable habitat, and it's going to push out the other. And Cathalamus is still okay, can still survive here, right? But their habitat has been reduced, right? They're partitioning their habitat, but this allows them to coexist. Now they'll much prefer to be on their own, right? They'll do much better if the other members aren't there. But if they are together, they can still coexist by partitioning their niche or their habitat. Niche, when I say niche is the way organism uses their habitat. It includes their space, food, all that kind of stuff. It's kind of this, whatever it is that however it is that the organism use their environment is their niche, right? You can't have two species that have exactly the same niche occupying the same space because they will compete, and whoever is going to be better is going to end up out competing. But however, if their niche is slightly different, then they can coexist. They might not be, again, they much prefer if the other ones aren't there, they'll be much better off, but they can still coexist. So here are these birds, kind of similar situation. They will take up the whole entire, each one of these will love to, take up the whole entire tree, and the population can increase and all that. But if the other birds are there, then they have a particular part of the tree that they kind of specialize in, so they can still live there, not as well as they would have, but they can still live there and coexist. So these are spatial partitioning. So this is partitioning by space. You can also have the temporal partitioning. So this is partitioning by time. So wolves and coyotes, again, living in the same habitat, probably feeding on the same type of prey and things like that. So they are competitors, right? They share the same resource. However, one might be more active during the day, the other one might be more active at night. They have slightly different hunting styles and things like that. And that allows them to coexist because they're not using their niche in exactly the same way. The niche overlap, but not completely. Right. Morphological resource partition has to do with the size, right? So one is slightly, again, same type. They're both weasels. They're both, living in the same habitat, feeding on same kind of prey, but if one is slightly bigger, then they'll eat the bigger ones of that prey. And then I think black-footed ferrets eat like little groundhogs, right? So they can eat the bigger groundhogs and maybe some other things, and then these little ermine things will eat the little guys. So they're partitioning because they're niche, because one is slightly bigger than the other, right? If they're the same size and feeding on the same type of prey, then the competition will be too intense, and then one's going to end up out competing the other. Okay, so there's different ways in which organism populations, species can partition their niche or partition their resources that will allow them to coexist. Okay, um, so they're still competing, right? But they're really trying to minimize the competition by reducing their niche. So the niche that they can potentially occupy is called a fundamental niche, and the niche that they end up occupying because of the presence of the other species is called a realized niche. right? And it's oftentimes smaller. Okay. All right. All right. So here is a question. I'm not going to read it because you can read it on your own with a multiple choice. See if you can answer that. Okay. And that is it for 1.1. In class, I'm going to do a quick some multiple choice questions, maybe 3 or 4 questions, and then another a practice FRQ. So we'll start talking about FRQs, which is free response questions, which is a type of essay writing that, and we'll practice using some of these skills and topics that we've discussed so far in this. So, okay. All right. Take care. Bye.